Hello, this is David Stringer with another edition of Prescott Talks. We have a very special guest today, Mike Vax, who is the founder and organizer of the Prescott Jazz Summit, which will be taking place later this month, I think the 25th to the 27th.
Yes.
Does that sound right, Mike?
Yep.
And in any event, let me introduce Mike Vax, known to many here in Prescott for his work in music and with the Jazz Summit. And you guys also have another series going at the Elks Theater, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. It's called a Jazz Journey.
Jazz Journey, okay.
And we do a monthly concert, and each month has a completely different theme. So that
I've been to a couple of them.
Yeah, we've had themes, everything from Latin music to gospel music to vocal music to bebop to everything you
Great
can
Ladies
imagine.
of Jazz. I saw that one.
Yep, that was a great one. And the one coming up in September after our festival, the one coming up on September 9th is the vocal tradition of Count Basie, and we'll have Dennis Rowland, who of course sang with Count Basie for many years.
Wow.
And we use the Prescott Jazz Summit All-Star combo that always backs everybody up. And those are going very well.
And those are once a month up on the third floor of the Elks.
Third
Is
floor
that right?
in
The Crystal Room.
the Crystal Room.
Right, yeah.
Yep.
I've been to a few of them, and they're almost always sold out, and they're just a great evening of jazz.
Well, it's
and
a
jazz
nice
history.
Yeah, it's a nice place too. I mean, it's just big enough so that it's like a nightclub atmosphere.
Yeah, tables, and you
ballroom,
can get
so to
wine
speak.
and things of that nature, and
Yep.
it's a really lovely evening. And the jazz history in particular, a lot of people maybe who are new to Prescott are not aware that we have here in Prescott. Of course, we have Mike, we have some other musicians who've played professionally in their careers, and we bring them up from the Phoenix area. I think you also bring them in occasionally from Laughlin and Vegas and all over the country, really.
Actually, from all over the United States, we've had people from all the way back to New York, and this year there's 4 or 5 coming from Las Vegas and 4 or 5 coming from Los Angeles, top studio players and 2 singers from Vegas, Ronnie Rose and Mike Ricciulo, who are just wonderful singers, and they'll be singing, especially featured with the big band Saturday night.
Terrific. Mike, a lot of our listeners, a lot of new people here. People are always moving to Prescott. So, we've talked, I think we talked last year, but again, this year, for people who don't know who Mike Vax is, you've been in the music business almost your whole life. I think you were something of a trumpet prodigy, came out of California, the San Francisco, Oakland area.
Yep.
And you've been involved in music and jazz and big band music your entire career.
Yeah, I actually joined the union when I was 16.
16 years old.
I was still in high school, and I had the chance. That was actually too young to join, but when some of the leaders wanted somebody to play, and they were big shots in the union, then because you were supposed to back then. You were supposed to audition for the union and all that.
I see.
And there was this one society band, Dick Smith and his orchestra, and he wanted me to play in the band, so they just sort of did a dispensation.
So were these little paid gigs that you had when you were still in high school?
Oh yeah, they were regular union gigs.
Yeah,
they were union pay.
That's
so
terrific.
I started, and then my senior year in high school, I was a sub for the Oakland Symphony. And did some playing with.
So, how did you learn to play trumpet? Did you get it through just high school and public school
Started
training,
in
or
elementary
private
school.
tutoring, or?
Yeah, elementary school. Actually, it's a funny story. They used to have what we called song flutes. Now they call them recorders. Mm-hmm. And in the 3rd grade,
I had one.
They would hand them
made out of wood.
Yeah, Mrs.
Mine was wood. Yeah.
Mine was plastic, but Mrs. Aldridge, the orchestra conductor. Would hand them out, and then she'd assign stuff, and that you'd have a little class every few days. And so about 6 weeks into that year, I went to Mrs. Aldridge and I said, "What do you want me to do now?" And she said, "I want you to do next week's lesson." And I said, "No, you don't understand. I know the whole book." So I played the stuff in the back of the book for her. And she told some other teachers, "What do I do with this kid?" But so in the high 3rd grade, they put me in the orchestra. We didn't have any money to buy a horn, and all the horns were pretty much given out. She found this old beat-up cornet, didn't even have a case, And she handed it to me and said, "This is what you're playing." So the horn actually found me. I didn't find
Got
it.
you. Yeah, that's interesting. So you started with a cornet.
Yeah.
That was my instrument in, I think, in the junior high school up in Anchorage, Alaska. I took band, and that was my first instrument.
Yeah.
And I didn't stick with it. I moved over to the piano later on, but that was how I started with music. That's how I first learned to read music.
There you go.
I learned about harmony and the notes and the scales and all that kind of stuff. Now, Mike, I have to say I cheated a little bit today when I found out I was going to do an interview with Mike Vax. I Google searched you, and I came up with really just some amazing information. You've had just an incredible career. You have personally played with some of the jazz greats. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've been very lucky. Although, to me, it's like I tell the kids that when I do the workshops with the kids, I say, everybody says, well, you get lucky breaks, but luck only comes if you're prepared. So I ask them for the Boy Scouts motto, which is be prepared.
Yeah.
And if you're prepared and you get a lucky break and you have an audition or whatever, and you can do a good job, then that lucky break becomes, a real job. So I've played with the ghost bands of Harry James, Jimmy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, and of course I played with Stan Kenton when he was alive, and now I lead the Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra, which is one of the last touring big bands. We still get on the bus and do one-nighters.
Yeah, I noticed that in the Stan Kenton Orchestra, the Legacy Orchestra. They're still around. They're still playing.
We did a tour this year in the Midwest. Next year we'll be on the East Coast.
And I have to say, you forgot to mention the Dukes of Dixieland, which was one of the first, maybe the first jazz album that I ever owned as a kid. I don't know if you were on that album, but I know you did play or lead the Dukes of Dixieland.
The Asunto brothers, Frank and Freddie, were the leaders of that band. That band started in the late 40s. And Pete Fountain played in it.
Yes.
A lot of the famous New Orleans players played in that band. But they went for years and years. An interesting thing, the very first high-fidelity recording was the Dukes of Dixieland.
Wow.
The very first one. It was on a company called Audio Fidelity. And so
would this have been in the 50s when High Fidelity kind of first came in?
Yes.
I might have had that album, yeah.
And so when Frank passed away, then they called me because they knew I was with the Con Company at that point, and they knew of me through that company that I had led bands and that I knew how to play Dixieland music. Because, of course, I wasn't in New Orleans. And so they brought me to New Orleans, and I led the Dukes for about 2.5 years after Frank Asunto, the original leader, died. And it was great,
Well, that was popular and accessible jazz. And then there's another side of jazz that kind of I won't mention names, but you know who they are, that are sort of got a sort of the more progressive jazz, I think they referred to it, that got a little esoteric.
Well,
but the stuff you do is very accessible.
Oh, yeah. And people have somehow a weird concept about jazz music. But jazz music entails so many different kinds of music. There's Latin jazz, there's swing from the big bands, there's Dixieland from New Orleans, there's bebop, which of course became more esoteric and more cerebral, and then there's later on smooth jazz, and there's jazz rock, like with Chicago and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. So jazz it entails so many different kinds of music. And if you really think about it, rock and roll came from jazz through rhythm and blues in the 40s. The original rock and roll players were rhythm and blues players. And the very first rock and roll hit was
Rock Around the Clock.
Rock Around the Clock with Bill Haley and the Comets. That they didn't write that. It was written in the early 1900s in New Orleans, and it was called Joe Avery's Blues.
Wow.
And all they did was change the key, play it on guitars, and add words. But Joe Avery's Blues has been around forever. In fact, later on, if you want me to play, I'll play Joe Avery's Blues for you. That's perfect.
All right.
So rock and pop music really came from jazz music.
Thank you.
And jazz music, one of the most important things, jazz music is the only art form invented in the United States. And some people say, well, wasn't it invented in Africa? No, the first people that played jazz music were Black Americans, but they had never seen Africa. Their parents and grandparents had come over as slaves. And a lot of the music from the slaves, what we call work songs and hollers, were sort of the forerunners of what we do with jazz music. So they entailed rhythmics, ideas from the African tribes, and a different scale than what we use from classical music, from European music. And all of that came together in New Orleans.
Well, and a lot of it was based on sort of early American gospel music, church music, folk music. They were taking some of these early American tunes and they were giving them a different inflection, a different rhythm.
That's right. And
so it was a melding. It wasn't,
yeah, exactly.
You don't hear American jazz, well, now you do because it's been exported, but it didn't come from Africa, but the rhythms and the inflections and the scale.
But a big part of what the early black musicians played came from marching bands, from military bands. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to a John Philip Sousa march, some of the early Dixieland tunes have the same form as the marches. And they have the same rhythms. Basically they took a march beat and added syncopation to it from the African influence, which became the kind of beat that was used in New Orleans behind the jazz music.
So and as jazz developed, and I don't want to put words in your mouth or step on what you were saying, but as jazz developed in this country, of course, there's always been a large number of African Americans in the jazz industry, if you will. But there were a tremendous number of white bands and white performers.
Oh, yeah.
The Stan Kenton, Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman.
The interesting thing is that probably the first integration happened with jazz musicians. Back when there was still a lot of integration.
Introducing African American music to mainstream white audiences.
But I'm talking about black musicians and white musicians playing together.
Okay.
And there were bands in the 30s where in the South, if there were black and white musicians, they weren't allowed to play on a stage. And Benny Goodman was one of the early ones that Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton, and he had blacks in his band that was supposed to be...
Well, and they also had a black vocalist, Jimmy Rushing, people like that.
And so musicians have always been, jazz musicians have always...
Yeah.
A lot of the slang comes from us. A lot of the way people dress comes from us. Jazz musicians have had a lot of influence over the years.
There's always been this understanding among white jazz musicians about where did this music really come from.
Yeah, and there were white musicians playing at the same time there were black musicians. But the origins of it, there was a place called Congo Square in New Orleans. And they would get together at night, and it was just a conglomeration of instruments. It wasn't anything that we would think of today. And they would just get together and have what we now call a jam session. And out of that, then forms of the music started happening that came together to be more advanced. And so at the same time that the blacks were playing the music, white musicians were playing, and it moved very quickly out of New Orleans into Kansas City, Chicago, New York, San Francisco.
That was going to be my next question, because you don't have to get too deep into jazz until you learn that there were different kind of sounds from different areas. You had the Kansas City sound, you had the New Orleans sound, you had the St. Louis sound, you had the Chicago sound. So could you what are the differences?
One of the main differences, when it first moved from New Orleans to Chicago, King Oliver brought his band, and his second trumpet player was a young Louis Armstrong.
Right, I remember reading that.
He brought the band to Chicago, and in New Orleans, first of all, those musicians were not educated. A lot of them didn't even go to high school, and they couldn't read music. Everything was done by ear. They learned tunes by ear. And so their solos were pretty much based on the melody. And there was a lot of soloing together at the same time, especially because a lot of their jobs were played outside. So just one person playing.
You mean outdoors?
Yes.
When you say out.
Yeah. And so when the music moved to Chicago, is when they started with more improvisation, single improvisation, individual musicians creating improvised solos. And one of the most important was Louis Armstrong, because he was one of the first to start soloing over the chords that the piano player played, rather than just playing from the melody. That was a huge deal. That changed everything in jazz, when they started actually improvising on the chord structure of the tune, rather than just playing from what they remember of the melody.
That's fascinating.
It's a
fascinating
huge
history and
difference.
insight.
Yeah.
Mike, we're going to run out of time if I don't get to the Jazz Summit that we're going to have here in Prescott. So could you touch a little bit on the program and some of the things that are going to happen on each night? Starts on the 25th and runs through the 27th. And I know the 26th is your big night at the Rue Street Theater, but there are other parts of the summit.
Well,
so
Friday night, we're at the Elks Theater.
Okay.
And that is a themed show, and it's going to be Jazz Goes to Broadway in the Movies.
Okay.
And we're going to pick all kinds of music from Broadway shows and movie themes and all that, and play them in jazz style. So, and we've done some other ones like that. We did one of those up at the top of the Elks.
I remember that.
And very, very popular with people. So Friday night is Jazz Goes to Broadway in the Movies, and that's at the Elks Theater. Saturday from 10 until 2 at Root Street Theater at Prescott High School, we have workshops where we work with all of the students and teach them about jazz music, teach them about their horns and everything. But that's open to the public and it's free.
Thank you for pointing that out. I know that's something you've done every year, and it's something you particularly have been doing all of your career. I read that you've done several thousand of these workshops or clinics all over the world for young people.
And
or for
it's
actually
important
anybody.
because we get to get people to understand the music better. But also, I think when you know more about the music and the history of the music, it's easier to have a love of the music. So anyway, 10 to 2, please, adults, it's open to everybody, free, okay? And
if you don't play an instrument, can you just come and watch?
Of course. We'll have a whole section just talking about jazz history. So, yeah, that's...
And that's free?
That's free.
That's free at the Rue Street Theater on Saturday morning from 10 to
2.
To 10 to 2. Terrific.
Yeah, and then Saturday evening is the Gala All-Star Big Band, and it really is an all-star big band.
I can vouch for that. I've been there almost every year now.
Musicians from all over the United States that have played with the famous big bands. One of the guys that's coming in for the second time is Walt Johnson, who's the only trumpet player who ever played first trumpet for both Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley.
And where do you find these people? You're always bringing in musicians who have, of course, professional musicians who played with some of the top performers in the industry. And how do you find them? Is it people you personally know? Or?
Yeah, I've played with most of them that I bring in over the years in different bands.
Okay.
You know, and so anyway, so Saturday night is the big band, the Gala. And then Sunday all day we're at the Hacienda. We do jazz brunch from 9:30 to 12:30. They put out a spread you wouldn't believe, and we have jazz music going for the the whole time that they're eating. And then Sunday afternoon we have another concert at the Hacienda. These are both in the Marina Room, and Sunday afternoon will be combos and just some straight ahead jazz stuff.
So that's, and let me count. Is that 4 or 5? Major events that you're having over the weekend.
And then Sunday night, we also have a jam session at Murphy's.
Gotcha.
That closes everything out.
Terrific. Now, one of these things are free, but the others, I take it, you need tickets for. You need to, because you have limited seating or limited availability. How do people get tickets? How do people get tuned into this?
Well, the best way is to go to PrescottJazzSummit.net.
We're going to put this on the screen as well.
Yeah, PrescottJazzSummit.net. You can call 925-872-1942 if you want information. But all the information is on the website, PrescottJazzSummit.net. And so, and you can order all your tickets there.
Terrific.
And,
now can you buy the series or you can go a la carte?
Exactly. And there's so many, if you go to the bigger jazz festivals, you're going to pay $100, $200 a concert. The tickets are ridiculous. Friday night, is $32. Saturday night is $40. The jazz brunch is $65. The Sunday afternoon is $30. But you can get an all-concert badge where you go to, not the food events, but all the concerts,
All the music events.
for $90. And you can get a patron badge, which includes a Meet the Musicians reception for the patrons on Friday and the jazz brunch. And that's $170. It's unheard of to have ticket prices
Sounds like a
that
bargain.
low.
That's a great weekend of jazz
the
music.
idea is we want people to come. This is nonprofit. We're not looking to make a whole bunch of money. All we care about is we hope every year that we can at least pay all the bills and the musicians. Some years we don't get quite there, but we just keep it going. We've done it 22 years. We've kept it going, and a lot of people say, "Wait a minute, I heard about Prescott. Isn't that a cowboy town?" Now, come on. How do you have jazz?
Oh, no, we're much more cultured and sophisticated.
And I say,
every year we get more cultured.
And there's still a lot of people that love big band music, love jazz music here. And as you say, people are moving in, the retirees. Well, they're old enough to remember this music when it was actually being played. So, and as you said earlier, the kind of jazz we play is very accessible. We do not play any far out stuff. We play music that entertains people, and that's the main job of the festival. Is to entertain everybody and have a good time.
Well,
and be
every
relaxed.
time I've been to one of your events, I know a little bit about jazz, not too much, but I know a little bit. But I recognize a lot of the tunes. You're playing stuff that I've heard before, that I'm familiar with, that we've heard on the radio, stuff that we'll recognize and understand. It's a very kind of easy listening kind of jazz, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. For us, that's the whole thing. And the musicians that I hire understand that. They're not here to be highfalutin, let's prove something.
Right.
They're here to entertain the audience.
I appreciate that spirit. Mike, we're almost out of time, but before I let you go, I'm wondering if you might, circling back here to something you pointed out a couple of minutes ago about the Rock Around the Clock tune, and how that was actually a tune that had been written and played many years earlier.
Right.
Could you give us a little sample?
Right. And so it's done they still use it a lot at Mardi Gras.
Okay.
And it always starts out with a trumpet call, and then it goes into the tune, which everybody will remember, but it's got a little bit different rhythmic pattern than what you remember about Rock Around the Clock.
That was terrific. That was a treat. Thank you so much for doing that. I need to sign off. We're just about out of time here. We are out of time. In fact, this has been David Stringer with Prescott Talks, and with our special guests, Mike Vax, telling us about the upcoming Jazz Festival. We're going to put everything on the screen for you. And it's a great weekend. I promise you, I've done it every year now for the last half a dozen years or so, ever since I've been in town. And I encourage everyone to take it in. It's a wonderful weekend. Mike, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much. Okay.